Greetings everyone. In this short video, I'm going to discuss with you and show you a little bit more about standard in and standard out. Now, at this point in your programming career, you've been writing code that uses either in or standard in or out or standard out. Now, let me kind of elaborate on the bigger picture, what that kind of means. And what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes kind of goes with any language that you're going to be learning or using, not just Java, which is the language that you're using in right now. So this concept can be applied to really most, if not all, languages that you're going to be using. Now, programs have input and they have output. Now, the input is usually called standard in. That's things that are going into a program. And our output is called standard out or sometimes standard error. Because standard error, again, is kind of like an output stream that when errors or bad things happen, where do we write this message to? And you've already seen that with your programming in Java. If you have an error in your program, you see the error message on your, on your monitor or your screen or what have you. That's standard error. So each of these are mapped to something. We have standard in, standard out, and standard error. Standard in is usually by default mapped to your keyboard, meaning that the input to a program is going to be coming from a keyboard. That sounds like it's kind of redundant, doesn't it? Like it's obvious, like isn't my input always from a keyboard? But that's not always the case. More about that in a second. And standard out, like for example, if we have a program that says out.println, Mary had a little lamb. You see that on your monitor, and you might be asking yourself, well, that's obvious too, because the output is always going to be at a monitor. Not always the case. And with standard error, for example, your program has an error, a null character divide by 0 or something, and you see that error message while your program is running on your computer monitor. Now, again, you might think about that as being obvious, like, well, of course, it's going to show this error message on my monitor. That's where those error messages get shown. Again, not always the case. So here you have standard in, standard out, and standard error. Now, I just gave you the defaults to them. Again, by default, input comes from a keyboard, output goes to a monitor, and your error messages go to a monitor. But, however, you can map that. You can actually map where standard in comes from. It could be a keyboard or in other places. You could map where standard output is. For example, if you wanted to write something to not to a monitor, you could map that as well. Same thing with error, standard error. So when you first start using standard in, standard out, and standard error, you don't really need to know that much about them because by default, it kind of gives you what you want without you really having to understand more about what standard in, standard out, and standard error is. But as you progress in your programming career, you're going to need to know how you can remap where standard in comes from, where standard out goes, and where standard error goes. And that's pretty simple, and it's going to be different for each language that you learn, but the concepts are basically the same. So think about standard in for a minute. Think about other inputs that could go into a program. Now, what you've been doing so far probably is you've been using the keyboard. However, input to a program can be other things. It could be from a file. It could be from an XML stream. And don't write these down because it could be a multitude of things. So I'm not going to give you a quiz and asking how many because it just really depends on where you want your input to come from. And your output can go in different places than your monitor. Here we have standard out going to your monitor. Standard out can go to a file if you want to write to a file. It could go to another program. It could go to memory. It could go to a lot of different places. So in this graphic here, I changed standard in to come from a program. And that's just this kind of silly graphic I have here to the left before we have that arrow for standard in. Now, prior to this, standard in, in my graphic came from the keyboard. Just showing you that it could come from somewhere else, too. In this case, standard in is coming from a file. So we would have to write code differently for this, but not right now we're going to do that. Right now, I'm just selling you on the concept. And here we got standard out actually going to a file, like I have in my graphic on the very top, and standard error here on the bottom, I'm just having go to the terminal. The big picture I'm trying to sell you on this is eventually standard in is not going to come from a keyboard, standard out is not going to be the terminal, and standard error is not going to be the terminal. So here we got, again, standard in coming from a file, standard out going to a file, and now on this graphic, I just put standard error going to a file as well. So just in this graphic here, I'm showing you how conceptually that standard in, standard out, and standard error can be different things and can go to different places. Now, I think in the recent work you've been doing, you might be doing things such as writing files. So that's a very good example, because standard out for the program if you're writing Java would be, if you're using a file, perhaps to write a file rather than write something to the terminal. So you're going to have to do things programmatically to kind of remap where standard out goes, like to a file. So anyway, in this short video, I wanted to show you the difference between standard in, standard out, and standard error, and know that they're configurable and you can remap them. Thank you.